Freedom Now movement, hear me. We are requesting all citizens to move into Washington, to go by plane, by car, bus, any way that you can get there. Walk if necessary. We are pushing for jobs, housing, desegregated schools. This is an urgent request. Please join. Go to Washington.
There are many political trends, ideologies, and groups that advocated and fought for the rights of Black people in America. One of the most influential one was the nonviolent protest and civil disobedience. Inspired by leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., peaceful resistance through sit-ins, marches, and boycotts like the Montgomery bus boycott or the Greensboro sit-ins were defining strategies of this movement. For a while now, however, the ideas of Martin Luther King have been stolen and misrepresented by liberals, his anti-capitalism whitewashed into mere anti-racism within the system, and his anti-establishment removed from history. Now, the right is also attempting to do this, and used his I Have a Dream speech to justify removing DEI and supporting their agenda in the US. This appropriation of who MLK was and stood for seems to be done by people who seemingly only know one thing about Martin Luther King.
I have a dream. My poor little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character.
So who was the real Martin Luther King? In this rather short video, which will not do justice to him, we're going to go through some of his speeches as well as his book to talk about what his ideology was. This video aims to neither promote or criticize his ideology, but rather just paint a realistic picture of it. At the time of his death, MLK was so immensely popular that the ruling class, even after his assassination, could not ignore him. Instead of removing him from the history books or demonizing him, as it's been done with many freedom fighters such as Malcolm X or Fred Hampton, he was celebrated. His ideas, however, were deformed and filtered to lose their revolutionary and anti-capitalist rhetoric. Martin Luther King Jr. frequently spoke about capitalism and imperialism, especially in the later years of his activism. While he initially focused on civil rights, by the mid-1960s, he increasingly critiqued economic inequality and US foreign policy, connecting the experience of Black people in the US with the overall effects of capitalism. For example, on April 4, 1967, MLK delivered a speech called Beyond Vietnam, A Time to Break Silence. In it, King condemned the Vietnam War, linking it to broader issues of militarism, racism, and economic injustice. He argues that the war drains resources needed to address poverty and social inequality in the US, while perpetuating violence and suffering in Vietnam. King also critiques the US government's role in supporting oppressive regimes globally, emphasizing the interconnectedness of struggles for civil rights, economic justice, and peace all around the globe. If America's soul becomes totally poisoned, part of the autopsy must read Vietnam. He calls for a revolution of values to challenge the giant triplets of racism, extreme materialism, and militarism, urging solidarity with the poor and oppressed worldwide. King explicitly condemned US imperialism, calling the US the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. Later in the same month, in his Why Am I Opposed to the War in Vietnam speech, he said, "The time has come for America to hear the truth about this tragic war. In international conflicts, the truth is hard to come by because most nations are deceived about themselves. Rationalization and the incessant search for scapegoats are psychological cataracts that bind us to our sins, but the day has passed for superficial patriotism." This statement originates from a sermon Dr. King gave on April 30, 1967 at Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, Georgia, where he reflected on his earlier widely recognized April 4th speech at Riverside Church. During the sermon, he spoke out against the Vietnam War again and expressed admiration for Muhammad Ali's decision to become a conscientious objector. He went to say, reiterating his earlier point, "When machines and computers, profit motives and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered." He again repeated these points in his book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community, published in 1967, that addresses the challenges facing the civil rights movement and American society at large. King critiqued the systematic issue of poverty, racism, and economic equality, arguing that the civil rights movement must shift its focus from desegregation to achieving true economic and social justice. Not that desegregation isn't crucial, but it's not possible to rid ourselves of racism with capitalism still kicking around. He emphasized the need for a revolution of values again in his book, to combat the triple evils that he mentioned earlier in his speeches of racism, poverty, and militarism. King calls for guaranteed basic income, better education, and affordable housing to address these systematic inequalities. He also advocates for non-violent resistance and global solidarity to achieve these goals, urging Americans to reject materialism and militarism in favor of building a just, equitable, and compassionate society. This book serves as both a critique of the status quo, aka capitalism, racism, and US imperialism, and a hopeful vision for a future rooted in community and shared humanity. In it, he says, where do we go from here? First, we must massively assert our dignity and worth. We must stand up amid a system that still oppresses us and develop an unassailable and majestic sense of values. We must no longer be ashamed of being black.
I want to say to you as I move to my conclusion, as we talk about where do we go from here, we must honestly face the fact that the movement must address itself to the question of restructuring the whole of American society. There are 40 million poor people here. And one day we must ask the question, why are there 40 million poor people in America? And when you begin to ask that question, you're raising a question about the economic system, about a broader distribution of wealth. When you ask that question, you begin to question the capitalistic economy. And I'm simply saying that more and more, we've got to begin to ask questions about the whole society. We are called upon to help the discouraged beggars in life's marketplace. But one day we must come to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring. It means that questions must be raised. You see, my friends, when you deal with this, you begin to ask the question, who owns the oil? You begin to ask the question, who owns the iron ore? You begin to ask the question, why is it that people have to pay water bills in a world that's 2/3 water? These are words that must be said. Now, don't think you have me in a bind today. I'm not talking about communism. What I'm talking about is far beyond communism. My inspiration didn't come from Karl Marx. My inspiration didn't come from Engels. My inspiration didn't come from Trotsky. My inspiration didn't come from Lenin. Yes, I read Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital a long time ago. And I saw that maybe Marx didn't follow Hegel enough. He took his dialectics, but he left out his idealism and his spiritualism, and he went over to a German philosopher by the name of Feuerbach and took his materialism and made it into a system that he called dialectical materialism. I have to reject that. What I'm saying to you this morning, communism forgets that life is individual. Capitalism forgets that life is social. And the kingdom of brotherhood is found neither in the thesis of communism nor the antithesis of capitalism, but in a higher synthesis. It's found in a higher synthesis that combines the truths of both. Now, when I say questioning the whole society, it means ultimately coming to see that the problem of racism, the problem of economic exploitation, and the problem of war are all tied together. These are the triple evils that are interrelated.
It is also worth mentioning that the communism he speaks of here is what was referred to strict Stalinism at the time. But from his speeches and his book, it becomes clear what his ideology was. He was a Christian that above all believed in God and believed that God wanted people to look out for one another. He thought capitalism was against this very notion, and because of that, he wanted to fight against US imperialism and global capitalism as a way to get rid of racism. He believed in non-violent and civil disobedient methods to bring about this change, but he never advocated for consenting to oppression, whether or not it's for yourself or for those around the world. And he recognized that oftentimes societal change comes from the individuals, so he advocated for individuals to fix themselves and how they view the world around them and themselves in order to bring about change in society as a whole. I hope this video has helped to present a more realistic summary of Martin Luther King's vision. Of course, a short video like this could never do a man like him justice. If interested in exploring further the relationship between capitalism and racism, check out the first episode of my podcast entitled Why is Sexism, Racism, Homophobia on the Rise Again? The link for it is in the description. In the episode, I dive deep to explain the intimate relationship between sexism, racism, homophobia, and capitalism.